You think you know what terror looks like. You've seen the movies, read the sanitized history books, scrolled past the clickbait articles about ancient warfare. But let me tell you something that'll make your skin crawl in ways you didn't think possible. The Vikings didn't just kill people. They turned death itself into an art form, a grotesque theater of suffering where the curtain never fell until every scream had been wrung from the victim's sea throat. And here is the part that should really disturb you. Some of these executions were so elaborately cruel, so meticulously designed to maximize agony, that historians still debate whether they actually happened or if they were just propaganda meant to terrify enemies into submission. Either way, the fact that someone even conceived of these methods tells you everything you need to know about the Viking psyche. So buckle up, because we're about to descend into a pit of venomous serpents, quite literally, and explore death so horrific that medieval chroniclers struggled to find words adequate enough to describe the carnage. Picture this. It's 865 CE, and Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking warlord whose name alone could empty coastal villages, finds himself in chains. This man, who had terrorized half of Europe, who had sailed up rivers that weren't supposed to be navigable just to prove he could burn your monastery before breakfast, has finally met his match in King Gla of Northumbria. Now, here's where it gets deliciously medieval in its brutality. Gla didn't just want Ragnar dead. Anyone with a sword could accomplish that in 30 seconds. No, Gla wanted Ragnar to understand that his reign of terror had consequences, that there existed suffering beyond anything even a Viking could imagine. So they dug a pit. Not just any pit, mind you, but a carefully constructed chamber of torment, and they filled it with snakes. Adders, most likely, the venomous serpents native to Britain, their fangs dripping with neurotoxins, and hemotoxins that would turn a human body into a failing biological system one agonizing bite at a time. The historical sources, including the Ragnar Saga and Saxo Grammaticus's Justa Danorum, agree on the core details, even if they embellish the poetry. They stripped Ragnar of everything, his armor, his weapons, his dignity, and lowered him into that writhing mass of scales and venom. Now, let's pause here, because modern people don't really understand what snake venom does to you. It's not like the movies where you get bitten and dramatically clutch your chest and fall over. Depending on the species, you're looking at hours of consciousness while your nervous system misfires, your blood refuses to clot properly, your tissues begin to necrotize from the inside out. Ragnar would have felt every fang piercing his skin, every injection of poison coursing through his veins, his muscles seizing, his organs beginning their slow shutdown. The saga claims his final words were a taunt about his sons, how the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. Whether he actually said that, or whether some saga composer added it centuries later, doesn't really matter. What matters is that Ragnar Lothbrok, who had dealt death casually across 2 continents, died in a hole surrounded by hissing reptiles, his body failing him piece by piece, bite by bite. But here's the truly terrifying part. That wasn't the end of the story. That was just the opening act. Because Ragnar had sons, and those sons took the concept of filial devotion to absolutely psychotic levels. When word reached them about their father's serpentine demise, they assembled what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army, a force so massive would reshape the political landscape of England for generations. And they had one target in mind, King Gla. By 866 CE, they'd captured Eoforwick, modern-day York, and they'd gotten their hands on the man who'd condemned their father to that pit. Now, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by Christian monks who had every reason to downplay Viking atrocities, simply states that Gla died in battle. Clean, honorable. But the Norse sources, particularly the Ragnar saga composed in 13th century Iceland from older oral traditions, tell a very different story. They tell the story of the Blood Eagle, an execution so horrifically elaborate that historians still argue about whether it was physically possible or just extremely effective psychological warfare, propaganda. The ritual, if we can even call it that without retching, involved restraining the victim face down and methodically cutting open the ribs from the spine. Not quickly, not mercifully. Each rib was carved away from the vertebral column and broken outward, creating the grotesque appearance of wings spreading from the victim's back. Some accounts suggest the lungs were then pulled through the openings, though others argue the victim would die from shock long before that stage. The Orkney Saga and Skaldska Palmal both reference this practice, describing it as reserved for oath-breakers and those guilty of supreme offenses against Norse honor. King Gla, in condemning Ragnar to the snake pit, had committed the ultimate act of disrespect, and Ragnar's sons responded by turning his body into a monument to their father's suffering. The Blood Eagle execution raises a question that should haunt anyone studying Viking history. At what point does revenge stop being about justice and become purely about satisfying a sadistic need to inflict maximum suffering? Because let's be honest, killing Glau would have been simple. A sword through the heart takes seconds. But that wasn't enough. The Blood Eagle was theater, a public demonstration that said crossing the sons of Ragnar didn't just mean death. It meant having your body desecrated in ways that would make hardened warriors vomit. Whether the execution happened exactly as described or was embellished by saga composers doesn't diminish its cultural impact. The mere fact that people believed it could happen, that they passed down these stories for centuries, tells us that Viking society operated under a different moral calculus than we're comfortable acknowledging. They didn't just accept extreme violence as necessary. They celebrated it, ritualized it, turned it into poetry and song. But if you think the Blood Eagle represents the apex of Viking cruelty, you haven't heard about what happened at St. Ebb's Monastery in 870 CE. This incident, preserved in the Libellus de Exordio and chronicled by Florence of Worcester, reveals something even more disturbing about the Viking Age: the complete disregard for any concept of sanctuary or mercy. St. Ebb's was a monastery on the Northumbrian coast, founded by Ebbe the Elder in the 7th century, and populated entirely by nuns who dedicated their lives to Christian devotion. When Viking ships appeared on the horizon, the abbess faced an impossible choice. Historical accounts suggest she understood exactly what fate awaited them if captured: enslavement, repeated violation, dispersal across Scandinavia as property. So she made a decision that still defies comprehension. She convinced every woman in that monastery to mutilate themselves, to take blades, and cut off their noses and upper lips, destroying their faces in a desperate attempt to make themselves undesirable to their attackers. Can you imagine the scene? Dozens of women, some of them teenagers, systematically disfiguring themselves while praying it would be enough to save them from a worse fate. The psychological horror of that moment, the collective despair required to choose permanent mutilation over potential capture, speaks volumes about what Viking raids actually meant for civilians. But here's the part that should make your blood run cold. It didn't work. The Vikings arrived, saw what the women had done, and responded with calculated brutality. They didn't retreat in disgust or shock. They locked every door of the monastery and the church, barred every exit, and set the entire complex ablaze. The nuns who had mutilated themselves to avoid enslavement were burned alive, their screams echoing across the Northumbrian coast as the wooden structures collapsed around them. This wasn't just a raid for silver in manuscripts. This was punishment for resistance, a message that choosing disfigurement over submission warranted death by immolation. And then there's Saint Edmund, king of East Anglia, whose execution in 869 CE combines religious persecution with ritualized torture in ways that make modern readers squirm. According to Abbo of Fleury's Passio Sancti Edmundi, written in the late 10th century from eyewitness accounts, Edmund was offered a choice by the great heathen army: renounce Christianity, accept Viking overlordship, and live as a tributary king, or refuse and face consequences. Edmund chose faith over survival, declaring he wouldn't deny Christ or rule under pagan authority. The Vikings responded by turning his death into a spectacle. They bound him to a tree and began with whips, scourging his flesh until it hung in ribbons. But they weren't trying to kill him yet. That would come later. First, they wanted him to feel every moment of his degradation. Then came the arrows. Viking archers, skilled warriors who could put a shaft through a man's eye at 50 paces, deliberately aimed for non-vital areas. They turned Edmund into target practice, filling his body with arrows until he resembled a hedgehog, bristling with wooden shafts. The Passio describes how they shot him until he was covered with their missiles. Each arrow a fresh agony, each impact a new wave of shock and blood loss. And still they didn't let him die. Only after hours of this systematic torture did they finally decapitate him, throwing his severed head into the forest to prevent Christian burial. The execution of Saint Edmund wasn't about military necessity or territorial conquest. It was about breaking the will of Christian Anglo-Saxon resistance by demonstrating that even kings, even men who claimed divine protection, could be reduced to pincushions and tossed aside like refuse. These deaths share a common thread that is more disturbing than any individual act of cruelty. They were all designed to send messages. Ragnar's death in the snake pit told Vikings that even legendary warriors could die in degradation. The Blood Eagle execution of King Glai demonstrated that vengeance knew no limits. The burning of St. Ebb's monastery warned that self-preservation tactics wouldn't save you from Norse wrath. St. Edmund's arrow-riddled body declared that Christian kingship offered no protection against pagan fury. The Viking Age wasn't just characterized by violence. It was defined by violence as communication, as art, as religious ritual, as political strategy. When Saxo Grammaticus wrote that cruelty is remembered longer than valor, he wasn't making a moral judgment. He was stating a historical fact. We don't remember the names of brave Vikings who died honorably in forgotten skirmishes. We remember Ragnar in his snake pit, Glau with his ribs spread like wings, the nuns burning alive behind monastery walls, Edmund bristling with arrows like some grotesque saint's icon. These deaths became legend precisely because they exceeded normal boundaries of acceptable violence, because they demonstrated that human creativity in inflicting suffering knows no ceiling. So the next time someone romanticizes Viking culture with talk of brave warriors and noble battles, remind them about the snake pits and the blood eagles and the burning monasteries. Remind them that the Viking Age was an era when death wasn't just an occupational hazard. It was a carefully choreographed performance designed to haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives.